So yeah, I'm going to share just a fun little experience that I had working through this Spoonerism generator puzzle, as Paul mentioned. And as the title suggests, we tackled this puzzle in Typescript to begin with, and then I was unsatisfied. So I thought, what happens if I just port this code to Elixir? Yeah, so the Spoonerism generator puzzle looks a little bit like this. We take a string of words that represent a sentence and take the leading characters of each word and shuffle them onto the beginning of the following word all the way through until we get to the last word, and loop back around to the beginning and put that leading character onto the beginning of the first word in the sentence, with some extra edge case rules like we skip over very common words like the and, or any words that are less than 3 characters long. So it sounds pretty simple, right? And just to make it more interesting, we did this as a mob programming challenge where there was myself, another backend sort of inclined engineer, a couple of people from like a culture and people consultancy that are working with us, and also like a non-programmer manager. So it was a very nice mix of people, all mob programming in TypeScript. And so we sort of started with, okay, so who's the TypeScript expert? Who's going to drive this? And sort of crickets. So I thought, okay, fine, we'll just dive in and see how we go. We were warned that we should talk about the solution first rather than just dive into coding. So we wrote some pseudocode, and this was our plan. We'll split the phrase into words, split the non-trivial words into the prefix and their suffix, rotate that list of prefixes to shuffle the leading characters onto the next word, and then just like recombine them all together, right? And we got about 3 out of 4 steps the way through, and then just got stuck on that last step. So I couldn't actually sleep that night because we were under time pressure. We were like furiously coding. I had 4 different people shouting at me as I was trying to like come up with the solution. And then we ran out of time and had to go back to a meeting. And it was just so unsatisfying to not have solved this problem, but it should have been simple. So I think I woke up at about 5 a.m. the next day and said, no, I can't be defeated by this. I can TypeScript. So this is what I came up with. And it was good enough to make the test suite pass. So I thought, yes, success, ship it. And, it probably looks like it was written by a C programmer because that was me in a former life. But, I got it working. But how does it make you feel? Not great. Since doing mostly Elixir these days, it didn't feel wonderful to have to use a bunch of mutable variables, a C-style for loop with an index counter, some imperative continue control flow. And if you scan down to the end of this, there's like this indexed array access using mutable variables that are updated throughout a loop. It's kind of puzzling how it works at all, to be honest. But it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this talk. Just that it kind of works, but it's not great. And so I couldn't help but think like, oh, maybe this would be better in Elixir. Elixir's got kind of all the bits we need. We can split a string in Elixir, right? That's a good start. But you look at the next thing after doing this string splitting is this big old for loop. So how do I translate that to Elixir? And this sort of got me thinking that for all of the different types of loop that you might write in an imperative language, there's kind of a named function to do that in Elixir. So if you've got something that updates each array element, you'd use enum_map. Or if you need to have access to that array index, you can use .withIndex and then .map. If you need to accumulate a result, you can reduce. Just if you would normally search for a thing in a loop and then break or return early, you could use find. If you need to accumulate a result and then break or return early, you'd use reduce while. But what about a loop that updates each element of an array and accumulates state in some local variables? luckily we have enum.mapReduce, which has nothing to do with the Hadoop thing with the same name. Instead, it allows you to update, also transform each element in a list and accumulate some state along the way. And you get back out of it the transform list and the final accumulator. So in the example from the docs, they double each element in an array and sum them all up in a single pass. So that's kind of nice. So how do we use that? Well, if you have some local variables that you are updating in a loop and an array that you are looping over, you can then change that to a call to enum MapReduce to let you loop over a list and accumulate some results. And the thing that you're looping over, you use enum.withIndex to give you your loop index over a list. The accumulator that you pass in is the initial value of your local variables. So in this case, it's the length of the words array and this empty string. And then the result of all of this is the transform list and the final value of what those local variables would be. And the function that you pass into MapReduce is the next element in the list, its index, and the current values of those local variables. So if you squint and you stare at it for long enough, you can kind of see that there's like a bit of a mapping between these bits of code. So yeah, it's weird, but it works. And okay, so the loop body itself, this one's not too bad. We initialize some variables. There's an if with a continue and an else that updates an array and does some more variable stuff. We can do something pretty similar in Elixir, run a regex, do an if. We don't have continue to break it, to force the next iteration of a loop, but we can just, return the loop accumulator, the reduce accumulator unchanged, which kind of acts like a bit of a continue. And the rest of it's sort of fairly similar looking code. This is the one that I was most unhappy with, just translating stuff into Elixir. If you wanted to update a particular item in an array based on an index, you can do it like sort of trivially with a language that actually has built-in array support. But if you were trying to do that in Elixir with just lists, you'd have to like map over the entire list using with index, match on the item that's at the particular index that you're trying to update, and then put its update in there, otherwise leave it unchanged. And then, yeah, get the result back out. So yeah, pretty gross. And when you put it all together and you step back, you think, oh, okay, that's what that code looks like in Elixir. I gotta say, it's not an improvement at all. In fact, it's worse, quite a bit worse, I think. It's way wordier, and it's doing a bunch of contortions to try and write TypeScript code in a different syntax. So I think it's kind of time to go back to the drawing board and see maybe there's a different way that we can solve this problem actually using the features of the language. All right, so taking a step back, I thought, why not introduce some data types to kind of model this domain a little bit? That's a pretty nice trick to get some more bang for your buck in functional programming. So introduce this idea of a word and a split word. And a word is the index in the array of where it occurred originally and just its string. A split word is similar, it's indexed, but it's split out into a prefix and a suffix. Some functions, we love functions. So what was previously the sort of body of the loop can be extracted into a separate function. And in this case, it takes a word string and the index in the array, and it will return back to us either a sort of atomic word or a split word. So it's one or the other struct. We can use pipelines. Elixir is famous for its pipelines. So in this case, we can sort of start with our initial phrase, split it out, tag it with the index for each word, try and split it. And then this is a really handy function, enum.splitWith. Given a list and some Boolean predicate, it splits a list into two. So we've got, as a result, all the split words and all the trivial words based on whether after running the try split word function, we got a split word struct back. Okay, rotations. Yeah, I couldn't see a built-in function in the standard library to rotate a list, but luckily you can write it pretty easily using enum.drop and enum.take to rotate a list to the left, that is, drop items off the front and sort of put them on the back. But that's not quite what we needed for this puzzle. We actually needed to rotate it to the right. But being a kind of lazy functional programmer, I didn't want to think too hard about that. But I did realize that if you reverse a list and then rotate it to the left and then reverse it again, it's kind of like rotating it to the right. So that sort of worked out okay. Combining lists. This is a pretty handy function, zip with. Given two lists and a function that will combine them element by element, gives you a new list on the way out. So in this case, we have the list of split words and the list of prefixes that we need to use to update those split words. So you can use zip with to do that. And then the next step in the code is to use this combine function, which was taking a split word as input, combining its prefix and its suffix, and encoding that as just an atomic word. So we're nearly there. The next step, which was not obvious to me at first how to achieve this, was to put the list back in the right order. And without like an array data structure where you can sort of put things at specific indexes, it wasn't really obvious. And then I thought, how would I do this in SQL? And the answer there is, well, you just tag each of your records with what index you'd like them to be in, and then sort by that, which translated really nicely to how to do this in Elixir. So because I had this index on those structs, I could just combine these two lists out of order, but then sort them back into the right order, and it's all good. And so with that, that sort of finished it all off, and you can sort of see the final code shape when it's all roughly put together. So you can see that it makes use of pipelines. We're using some structs. We're using those handy functions, split with and zip with, and sort by, using an index to get things back in the right order. That certainly looks to me more like idiomatic Elixir code, not something written in a different alien language and then translated into Elixir. So the final thoughts is, as the saying goes, you can write Fortran in any language. And if you're learning a new language, translation from what you do know into the new language that you're trying to learn can be a starting point, but your mileage may vary kind of depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. Procedural code isn't always bad. Like if we go back to the very sort of first solution, I mean, it's okay. It kind of solves this problem well enough, and all the code fits in it like on a single screen in a single function. So even though it's not that pretty, at least you can sort of tuck it away and not worry about it once you've written it the first time. But learning the idioms of the language that you're in is important. And so knowing about the standard library in particular, I think it's worth putting the time into just to sort of read up on what's there and how you can use those functions. And yeah, mod programming with a big group of people with a tight deadline is hard, but it's fun. So if you haven't done it at your workplace or in this group, then give it a go. Okay, and that's it from me. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Has anyone got any questions? Were you able to take any of those enum calls and turn them into streams?
Oh, that's a good question. Challenge accepted, but I will have to get back to you on that one.
I think we'll do it not under mob programming conditions.
I think the one that I wouldn't mind trying is Erlang does have an array module in the standard library that does let you do kind of something a bit more like an index-based access, and it's some kind of tree under the hood. So I wouldn't mind actually using that. I've never used it in Ango, but that might be the answer to how to do some of these more index-based things.
I've just got a comment. I think I've found sometimes you made the comment about translation can be difficult, and I found that sometimes with things like exorcism, where there's a whole bunch of problems, and you can really find when some are more suited to some languages than others, and some you seem to be able to solve with Elixir trivially, and others you do seem to be, bending it to your will almost, which can be interesting. And also that comment about, stepping back and looking at how you're modeling the problem. Sometimes stepping back and, not trying to do things in the way that's done in the original, or just trying to take a different approach can be very beneficial. But yeah, that was nice. Thank you.
Thanks.
And that was a pretty basic sort of challenge, but I don't suppose you did any sort of like benchmarks comparing TypeScript and Elixir? Or do you think there would be any differences?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you pay that functional programming tax immediately as soon as you're building lists, as opposed to poking at arrays. Yeah, so I think it's great to always have that option as an escape hatch. Like if you need to do some lower level things, then yeah, you can only push Elixir so far, and then you've got to use NIFs or something. Actually, that would be a great talk suggestion if anyone has familiarity with Rustler or Ziegler. They look like really nice ways to get that extra performance out of your Elixir code by calling into Rust or Zig.
Send us an issue.
Yeah, it's on the back burner. Mike will know that I've just started learning Rust, so, or if he was paying attention to our work Slack, he would. Yeah. So one day, Paul, you might see an issue drop from me, but yeah, or hopefully someone else will though first.
Yep, absolutely. Anyone is welcome, always hungry for content.
Didn't we have a Rustler talk a while ago, or something about NIFs?
I do recall that we did, but that shouldn't stop anyone from doing a new one, because I'd wager that the way that you use them has changed or updated or new information or whatever else. And we don't have a recording of anyone who has done a talk on NIFs. So yeah, would be most happy for that.
Yeah, I think we had one, but it was more than 2 years ago, because I recall it was in person and I was still in Sydney. So
Yeah, was that Expert 360?
yeah.
Yeah, I think it was done by Randolph. I believe at the time he was working for Alembic as well.
Cool. Has anyone got any final questions for Mike?
Mike, have you had to do that a similar kind of thing, porting to Elixir, or at least imperative to functional in anger? Well, in a different kind of anger.
Well, yeah, the whole thing just reminded me of my initial learning experience. Like that was sort of almost nostalgic, going back to what it was like when it was like, oh, okay, loops and assignments and arrays is like, baked into your head, and that's what's coming out most naturally. And then having to, change your thinking and say, oh, well, what's the equivalent in Elixir to doing it this way? And sort of remembering that it's not automatic. Like you do have to retrain your thinking patterns to have that declarative style rather than the kind of imperative data structure updating in place sort of thinking. So that's probably the closest. Is like, I remember that the first time I was using Elixir full time, not just like for exercises, and having that experience of like, oh, I can't do an early return here. What am I going to do? I have to break this into functions. Oh, okay. But it is really nice when you get over that hump, and then you can sort of think in functions.